Okay, so in this video we're going to make some room transitions. We're going to be able to move between different rooms in our game, which is pretty great, and we're going to do it with a cool little transition effect. Okay, so moving between rooms and creating new ones. So let's go over to our room folder. Since we're going to have more than one room now, let's go ahead and rename this one. This one is decidedly my living room. So I'm going to name it RM_living room. And that's perfect. And now we can create a new one. Create room. And we can go ahead and call this one RM_bedroom. So an important thing to note here is actually, if we go up into this quick access folder, you'll see there is something labeled room order, which what this means is this is the order in which the rooms will appear in the game. So the first one on top here is always going to be the one the game starts in. So even though down here bedroom is on top, up here is where you would want to change the order. So if you wanted to start in the bedroom, you could just drag it above. Now the game will start in the bedroom. So we can go ahead and leave this here because we're going to suit everything up. Now we got to remember to set all of this stuff down here in the bottom left to the same when it comes to the viewports and cameras. So we need to enable our viewport. We need to make it visible. Remember, it was 288 by 216, and our viewport was 864 by 648. And we need to make sure that the camera is following the player object and that our speeds or our borders are half the width and the height of the camera, or just a super high number. Now for this room, this actually isn't going to be super important because I'm going to make this room the same size as our view. So that way the camera just stays totally stable. But it's good practice to just do this in every room in case you resize it or whatever. So I'm going to decorate this really quick. So I'm going to add my tile layer, and I'm going to add my tiles. Go down here in the tile layers, select my tile set, my house tile set. Then I'm going to get a little funky. Then I'm going to add some of my objects, and then I'm going to add a new instance layer for the walls again. Okay, so if we run this again, we'll start the game in our little room because up here it's the top in the room order. Okay, so now we have two fully functioning rooms. Now we just got to figure out how to move between them. So let's get out of here, close out of this, and we'll get back to our workspace. So let's make a new sprite. We're doing another good old 16 by 16 pixel square. I'm going to make it this bright green, and I'm going to turn this opacity down on this layer a bunch. So we're going to name this new thing. This is going to be sprite warp block. Okay, so let's make a new object. We are making object warp block. Set the sprite the same. And now we're going to make a create event here. So basically what we need to do to actually move the player between two rooms is we have to change the room that we're in, obviously, and we need to move our player to the correct X and Y coordinate of the new room. So let's set up some variables to do all that stuff. So we can have a target X, we can have a target Y, and we can have a target RM for target room. Now these zeros are obviously just temporary. We don't always want this to be where the player ends up, and I'll show you how we're going to set this for each one of these warp blocks in a minute. First, let's go to our step event. So we want to set this up to where once the player touches a warp block that we put down, the player will go to these correct coordinates and this room. So if place meeting our X and Y coordinate with the object player, so now place meeting is being called from the block, so it's saying if the player touches me, let's run this code. So the first thing we want to do is use this function called room go to. And what we're going to put in there is our target room. So whenever we set this target room variable, this function will take us there. The next thing we need to do is get the player's x and y coordinate correct. So to do that, we are going to say object player dot x equals target x. By doing this, by putting like an object name down and then putting dot, you can reference any variable that that object has initialized, which includes all the built-in ones like x. So this will just immediately be sending the player's x coordinate to this point. And if we do the exact same thing with the y values, now the player will go exactly where we need him to go. So now, how do we set these variables for each individual warp block that we need to put down? I will show you. So let's exit out of here, and let's open up both the bedroom, and we can open up the living room. We can swap between them up here. First, I'm gonna get rid of the grid so our objects won't snap around. Let's go to our instances layer. I've highlighted the warp block, and now we're gonna put the warp block down. So let's put it right here. This is about where we would want it to be. So in the room editor, if you double click this object, I've already showed you this menu and we messed around with the frames. There's also this little thing here called creation code. If you click on this, it opens up a little code window, and what instance creation code does from the room is it is code that you can add to every individual instance of any object, and it will run immediately after the initial create event of this object, and it will run before any of the other events do. It's basically just tacking on more creation event. So essentially what we can do, if we go to edit object, it'll open up our events here. We can go to our create event. Now we can take these variables, I'm going to copy them. We can put them in our instance creation event. And now if we set these variables, they will be specific to this object, and it won't make every single version of the original object do the exact same thing. Now we need to figure out what x, what y, and what room do we want to go to. Well, we know we want to send the player to the living room, so let's go room, living room. So that's correct, and now we need the right x and y coordinates. And to do that, we can just go into our living room. Oh, one thing we actually need to do, we don't want to have two versions of the player walking around, so we can go ahead and get rid of this. We just need to have the player in the first room that runs the game. So let's just get rid of that. So now, where do we want the player to end up? Let's just say right about here. We want the player to show up right here. So if you look down here, this will show you the exact X and Y point you are in the room where your mouse is. So if I just hover my mouse right here and I say I want my player to go here, that's 176 for the X and 112 for the Y. So we can go back over here and we can write 176 for the X and 112 for the Y. So let's see if that works out how I think it should. Okay, so wait a minute. Okay, I forgot something very important. Let's go back into our player object. Now over here, we have a little checkbox called persistent. And if you read the text that just showed up, this will make it so this object will persist between rooms. So that means that the game won't get rid of it whenever you walk out of that room. So now if we run our code, okay, there we go. Now we can move between rooms. But there's obviously a couple things going on here. First of all, it's pretty abrupt to just kind of pop into the next room. And on top of that, there's another issue, which let me rerun this really quick. It may be kind of hard to notice just because it's so instant, but this won't necessarily make our player face the right way. If I walk in with the right sprite, it starts facing the right, and we want the player to be facing downwards. So let's fix a bunch of this stuff. Now first, we're just going to fix the transition, since that will also help me illustrate the other issue. So here's how we're going to do this. Let's make a new sprite. Once again, we are going to resize to 16 by 16. So I want to do like a little effect where a diamond like grows outwards as the transition. So I'm going to go into this little grid here, and I'm going to change it to 8 by 8 just so I can see where the center is properly. Let's add a frame. I'm going to start here. You can copy and paste this. We're going to make it go out a little bit more. Do the same thing. And you get the idea. Let's just keep going. Okay, so I got this little diamond and just made it go all the way to the edge to where it's totally covered up. I kept the animation speed at 30. I think that looks pretty cool. We are going to leave this first one blank and this last one totally filled out. So just keep it exactly like this. Let's go back to our workspace. Don't need to change anything there. And now we can make a new object. So this object we're just going to call object warp. We're going to set it to that new sprite that won't show up here because the first one's blank. This is now going to be the object that we use to transition the player between rooms. So basically what we're going to do with this thing is we are going to have it animate, and we're going to tile that across the whole screen. So it covers up the whole screen whenever the little diamond fills out. Once the screen is covered, we're going to transition to the new room. We're going to reverse the animation, and then we're going to get rid of this thing once it's done with all of its different animation stuff. That might sound a little complicated, but it's actually really, really simple. There's not like a ton of code to do this stuff. So since this object is going to be warping us, we need to open up our old object warp block, and we're going to take these variables here. Now this warp block is still very important, so leave the variables here. We're just copying them, and we're moving them to the creation code here as well. The next thing we're doing is adding a new type of event. So let's go to add event. We can go all the way down here to other, and then there is an animation end event, where you could probably guess that this code only runs once the animation has ended. Our animation for this ends here on this frame where it's just completely covered up, and we're going to be tiling it over the screen. So that's when the screen is covered. So the code we want to run here is actually moving our player to the new room. So we can go back to our warp block. We can take this code here. We can actually take this code out. So I'm going to Control X to cut it, and then I'm going to paste it here in the animation end event. Now that we've transitioned to the new room, the next thing we need to do is to reverse this animation so the diamond shrinks back down. And we can do that literally by just saying image speed equals -1. Image speed is another built-in variable, and it just means how fast the animation is playing. The image speed always starts out as 1, and 1 just means whatever you have set in the editor for that specific sprite. So for this sprite, normally it is 30 frames a second, and if we make it -1, that changes it to -30 frames a second, which means it will start animating backwards. So that's all we need in this animation end event. Next, we can go ahead and move on to another new event called the draw event. So let's go down here to draw, just normal draw event. And this event, you can use functions and do all kinds of code stuff that will actually put visuals up on the screen. Even when you don't add a draw event to an object, it actually does have one there. It's just invisible. If you don't specify you want to have your own draw event, the object will just say, oh, I just need to draw myself. So now that we have opened our own draw event, we have to specify how we want to draw, what we want to draw and how we want to draw it. So this function here, draw sprite, if we choose our sprite index, we choose our image index, which is what frame we're on in our animation, and we draw that at our X and Y coordinate. That's pretty much what every object does anyways. So for this object, what we want to do is we want to do draw sprite tiled. And this does exactly what it sounds like. It just draws whatever you're specifying here tiled. Now for simplicity's sake, we could set this to 0 and 0. And basically what that would do is it would start drawing this sprite up here, and then it would tile it across the entire room. We have one more thing to do in this object, so we're going to go back and add our good old step event. The final thing we need to do is to get rid of this object once it's done all of its duties. And we already know that we want to get rid of this thing once it is done animating backwards. So here is a good way to do that. First, we want to check if we are in the new room that we want to be in. So we can say if room is equal to target room, run this code. So room is another built-in, and room just returns whatever room that the game is in right now. So if the room that we're in is the one that we're trying to get to, then we are ready to get rid of this object. But we only want to get rid of it once it is done animating backwards. So let's add another check here, and we will say, so if the room is the correct room, and if our image index is less than 1. So basically what this is doing, our image index is what image is being displayed by our object right now. So I'll open up this sprite really quick to show you. So our image index starts at 0. So this frame would be image index is 0. This frame is image index 1, image index 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You get the picture. So if we're checking if our image index is below 1, it basically means we are on this frame. The image index is very rarely actually just 0, 1, 2, whatever. It normally has some kind of decimal point because it's always adding a very small value to it to make sure it's animating at the correct speed. But it's always showing the number to the left of the decimal point, meaning if our image index is 0.9, it will still show us the 0 image, this image right here, the first one. If our image index is 3.9, it's still only going to show us this image, so 0, 1, 2, 3. It won't round up, it just shows whatever is to the left of the decimal point. So this just means if it's below 1, we're on this blank space here, which means it's basically invisible, and now we can get rid of it. So let's call this function instance destroy. This will just destroy itself. So basically this object will be totally gone at that point. Use this power wisely. Okay, so this should do everything we needed to do. So let's exit out of this. The only thing left is it's not going to make itself, and that's where our warp block comes back into play. So we obviously want to make this object whenever we run into our warp block. So let's use the function instance create depth. So this will make sure that whenever we create this object, we will be setting it at an appropriate depth. That's very important for this transition because we want it to show up pretty much on top of everything. So this calls for an X position, a Y position, the depth, and the object to create. Our X and Y position does not matter because in our warp object, in our draw event, we are just setting that manually. So really this could show up wherever. So just to make it easy, we'll just say we'll create it at 0, 0. Our depth we'll set to a very low number because like I explained, depth, the lower the number, the more on top it is drawn. So I'm going to set this to -9999. Okay, I said that right. And now we are just making the object warp. There's two things with this. One is that we still need to set the object warp's variables here. And since they're being created dynamically, we can't do it with creation code like we did with the warp block. But that's what the warp block is for. So something cool we can do whenever we create new instances is we can store the ID of that new instance with a variable. So I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to create a local variable, and to do that we say var space, we name our new variable, so we're going to call it inst, and we will say equals this function. Let's let this work itself out. Okay, there we go. So local variables are this light yellow color, and what local variables are is just a variable that you only need in this one event. So if I were to reference this variable in the create event, or if I made a draw event, or anything like that, it wouldn't recognize it. This is just for the step event. We only need it for the step event, so that's why we're doing this. So what this is doing is we've created a new variable, and anytime you use an instant create function, it returns the new ID of that object that's just been created, which means that, like earlier, whenever I referenced object player.x to set the player's x, we could say inst.x equals something. So we can access any variables in this thing that we've just created in the same way that we did with the player earlier. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to say this new instance's target x equals our target x, because target x has already been set in our warp block in the creation code of whatever room we were doing. This is how we can set all of the variables for this warp to be correct. So we can do this with both the y, the target y, and the target room. Okay, we're looking pretty good. Just one more check that we need to do, because right now, if the player is, is touching this warp block, every single frame that the player is touching it, it's going to create one of these warp objects. And we do not want that. So we're going to do one more check. So we're going to say if the players run into this block and not instance exists object warp. So a couple new things here. Instance exists is just a function that checks if there is an instance of this object in the game currently. And an exclamation point means not. So it means the opposite. So this is saying if this instance does not exist, then we can run this code. This is also one of those things where you could just type not, but again, this is just a little bit more proper. Might as well get used to this stuff as soon as you can. So if the players run into the warp block and there are none of that warper object around, then we can create this warping object. So that should do it. Let's run our game and let's see. Oh, I did it again. Okay, I've made the exact same mistake again. Let's go back to our warp object. Much like our player, this warp object also needs to be persistent, because what just happened there was once we left the room, it was just gone. So we want it to persist between both of the rooms so it can finish out the visual. Let's try again. Alright. Hey, look at that. Pretty cool. Now we can tweak this a little bit if we want. So for our warp transition, if you want it to stay covered up a little bit, you could just copy this last frame and just paste a couple more in there. It's honestly just the easiest way to do it. And if you wanted, you could change the color, you could make it black or whatever. I am actually going to make it the same color as this dark color here. So I just copied a little piece of that color so I could paste it here and then use this new color. This is what I'm going to do. Actually, if you keep it white, through code you can actually color this thing anything you want to, but we're not going to do that right now. That's something you can look into later. We can also go into our warp block and make it not visible, so whenever we run the game, it won't just be this weird ugly green square. Nice. But we are not done yet, my friend. I'm going to add a little return warp really quick just so I can demonstrate. So the first thing we need to fix is while the transition is happening, we can still move our player around, you see. And we probably want the player to actually wait. And I didn't put any walls there, so I can just even walk right up through there. So we probably want the player to pause while we're doing that. And another thing is, if we move this way, we don't end up facing the correct direction. These are very easy things to fix. So first things first, let's create an object that will tell our player to pause. So let's create an object here. We don't need a sprite for this. Object pauser, one that pauses. Much like the wall, we don't actually have to put any code here. The player is just going to figure it out. So let's open up our player, go into that step event. Okay, so let's make a really simple pause event. So we're going to go in between getting our speeds and setting our sprite. Basically all we need to do is check if a pauser exists. So if instance exists object pauser, we can just set our x speed and our y speed back to 0. Now for this little game, this will do exactly what we need it to. It's setting our speeds back to 0 before they can affect anything. So our sprites won't change, and we will be set back to our image index of 0 down here. There's a bunch of different ways to do like a pause event, and actually we can name this pause. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, including having the character have different states and make a very, very simple like state machine type thing, but we really just don't need to do that for this video. At some point in the future I might touch on something like that, or once you're done with this little thing, you can just go watch some other videos and look up states and GameMaker or something like that. If you got the programming itch and bug. But like I said, this will do exactly what we need it to do. So the last thing to do is we need to make sure that the game considers our warp a pauser as well. And we already saw how to make objects children of other objects with the wall. So let's go into our object warp, go into the parent, and select our parent as a pauser object. So as long as this thing shows up, the player will pause and set its speeds back to 0. So here we go. All right, perfect. So while it's up on screen, the player can't move or change direction or anything. So now we have to solve the facing issue. So if I walk to the right and I walk up, I show up to the right. Super easy fix. Let's go to the warp block first. There we go. Okay, so we are going to add one more little variable here, and we are going to call this target face. So now, much like these other things, in our creation code, we can set which way we want the player to be facing at the end. And here's how we're going to do this. So first things first, we need to add this variable over here, because we also need to add it to our warp object. So this instances our warp object's target face needs to equal the one set by the warp block. Let's go back into our warp object, just so we can initialize this here. Now we can go into our animation end event and add one more thing. We can say the object player's face now equals our target face. Easy. Let's go back into our rooms and set these appropriately in the creation code. So we'll go to our instances. I'm going to open this up. I'm going to add the target face value, and we want the player to end up facing down, and we can just use our macros for that. So down. Let's go into the living room, do the same thing, except this time we want to make sure that the player is facing up. Okay, let's check it. All right, let's see. So I'm going to come at this at a weird angle so we can check it actually sets everything right. Look at that. Look at that. Perfect. This is one of the beautiful little things about how we set up our player here to handle all of its sprite stuff by just using this little face variable. This variable can come in handy for a lot of different stuff, so just keep that in mind. Hopefully you're going to stick with me through that last video. Parallax backgrounds are such a cool effect. I'm honestly kind of hard-pressed to even think of some kind of modern indie game that doesn't do it in some kind of way. So yeah, watch it. But if now you kind of feel like you have the tools to go off on your own, then I'll just go ahead and say thank you. Excellent work. Genuinely. I know the completion rate for these types of tutorials isn't probably super high, so yeah, no, good job. Great work. The Discord community that I have for my game, I love to see other creative things that people are doing. There is a channel there for people to post their own creative stuff, no matter what it is. If you're working on something and you kind of wanted to show it off, that would be a good place to do it, because everyone who hangs out there is really cool, really nice. So yeah, and likewise, if you haven't played the demo of my game yet, you can try that out. I'm also working on another little side kind of game that I want to have done around October, and I have a couple plans for more GameMaker tutorials. One, by the time you even see this video, might already be done, because that was one of the ones I wanted to do at first, a text box system. But regardless, whatever. Just if you want to keep up, you know how to do it. But also don't be a wise guy. Watch the 6th part. All right, you're already here.